welcome. We're just going to give it a second to make sure everyone can come in from the waiting room. Great. And we'll kick off. So yeah, thank you so much everyone for joining us here today for this webinar, which is going to be focusing on the improving the energy performance of privately rented homes consultation. I'm Rachel Owens. I'm co-director of the National Retrofit Hub, and I'm joined by my colleague Cara. If you want to say hi, Cara.
Hello, everybody.
So we have got a pretty packed presentation for you today. The intention here is that we will be sending out our consultation response to you all and to our whole network tomorrow. And this webinar is going to give a bit of an overview of how we're planning to respond to each of the consultation questions. But it's also a bit of a last minute opportunity for you to have your thoughts. So really encourage people to use the chat as we go along. If you've got thoughts or comments on any of the questions or anything that you think we're missing or forgetting, put them in the chat. And then for the rest of the day today, we'll be doing a big deep dive on that to make sure that we are bringing through any thoughts that you have that we may well have missed. So yeah, please do contribute in that way. We'll send out a recording of this webinar, as I say, tomorrow, and also our draft consultation response. So you'll have the opportunity to read that in a much more detail, and also use it to inform your own responses if you'd like to. So yeah, without further ado, I'm going to kick off by sharing screen. Okay, so yeah, as I mentioned, this is all about a latest consultation that's come out from the government. This work has been a bit of a continuation of some work that we had done with the support of Impact on Urban Health, which was all about raising standards in the private rental sector. That was a report that Cara led. We'll put a link to it in the chat as well. And it really identified as one of the critical components that's needed to make sure that standards in the private rental sector are raised is minimum energy efficiency standards. So the deadline for this consultation is on the 2nd of May, so pretty soon. It applies to England and Wales, and it's proposing changes to a few different aspects of minimum energy efficiency standards. These are standards that specifically apply to the private rental sector, to privately rented homes. But there is the potential that they might also influence minimum standards in the socially rented sector when the decent home standard is reviewed as well. So it's worth bearing that in mind because this might be used as a bit of an inspiration or a template for that. So changes are proposed to the metrics and minimum standards, to the cost cap, to timelines and the transition towards the new standard, to how you might have to commission EPCs, to the scope of this regulation and where there are exemptions. And also there are some proposals to enable more smart meter uptake. This is also off the back of the recent EPC reform consultation, which we submitted a response to and held a webinar on. And we'll put a link to that in the chat as well, because the metrics that are proposed in the new EPC consultation play a big role in this new standard. So we're going to go through each of the questions that we'll be responding to. As I mentioned, we won't have time to go into all of the responses in detail, but you'll see our detailed response when we issue that tomorrow. So the first one is, do we agree of using new metrics, those proposed within the EPC reform consultation, as the basis for higher minimum energy efficiency standards? Generally, we support this, but within our response to the EPC reform consultation, we did raise some concerns on some of the metrics. So we've just made sure to highlight these here again, and I'm going to go into those in more detail on the following questions. So what are they proposing in terms of the metrics? Currently, minimum energy efficiency standards in the private rental sector require you to get an EPC of E, and that's based on the energy efficiency rating, which is an energy cost metric. That's the headline metric in the current EPC that you've got. What the government are proposing now is to use a series of metrics in a kind of hierarchy. So what they're suggesting is that a PRS home would have to meet first a fabric performance metric. They've said that that would be roughly equivalent to getting an EPCC with the current metric. After that's been met, the landlord could then choose whether they meet a heating system metric or a smart readiness metric. So a heating system metric would be one that ranks all the different heating system types from most carbon efficient and energy efficient to least carbon and energy efficient. And you'll have to get some way up that ranking. They haven't released the exact details of how that would work. Or a smart readiness metric would rely on you having things like smart controls, potentially PVs, potentially batteries, those sort of pieces of technology that enable you to moderate when you use electricity and therefore help out with the grid. So when we've the question here is really about do we want this sort of suite of metrics to be used, and do we agree with the hierarchy? So what we've started off by really emphasizing it, the regulations must first and foremost prioritize safety, thermal comfort, health and well-being of tenants, and that also includes reducing energy bills. So while normally at the Retrofit Hub, we like to sort of advocate for a holistic approach to building upgrade where you think about the whole building together and all of the different measures that you can take in tandem, we actually see the reason why the government is proposing this direction, because it means that prioritizing fabric performance will much more easily make sure that we can prioritize the health of those tenants. So in this circumstance, we would agree with the proposal. And that having that secondary sort of standard for incentivizing decarbonisation and demand flexibility. However, so in principle, we understand why they're doing this, but we think there are some risks associated with the strategy that would need to be mitigated. So here we've sort of pulled out from our engagement what the different risks might be. So first up, we don't think EPC is a high enough standard to use for the fabric performance metric. We would much rather see something along the lines of an EPC-B. We know of homes that have an EPC-C where the solid walls aren't insulated, where the ventilation is uncontrolled. So we don't think that's high enough. We think that fabric condition and performance must be included. Currently, a failed cavity wall wouldn't be picked up on an EPC. So those sorts of poor conditions can really have an impact on energy use and energy efficiency. We think that there's a really great potential for real world data to help validate fabric performance, and that should be built into the fabric metric. And we also think that the fabric metric must address ventilation directly. At the moment, there's no space for ventilation within an EPC. And if we're really going to be pushing the standards of how airtight and thermally efficient our homes are, ventilation needs to be built in. There's need for guidance on how to support and limit disruption for tenants. We think that there's definitely some role here for incentivizing medium-term retrofit plans and encouraging landlords to have a vision towards best practice in net zero beyond these standards. Thermal bridges need to come into it. We also think there are issues associated with the heating system metric, which we've pulled out in our EPC reform consultation, largely around barriers to innovation. And we're also worried about the risk of incentivizing something like a direct electric heating where that isn't appropriate for the type of building, and then tenants being landed with larger bills. And we also think there's a need for education on smart readiness so that we're not digitally excluding those who might be older or more vulnerable, and at the same time enabling the behaviour change benefit that comes along with that. And we think as well, it's really important that the government includes in the framing of all this that the three metrics suggested are complementary. Fabric upgrade, decarbonisation and energy flexibility need to be seen as going hand in hand rather than metrics that are competing with one another. And targeting those fabric upgrades first makes sense because it means we can then install smaller systems to meet the next two metrics because you've got a lot lower heating load to meet. They've also suggested a few other proposals. So there's a proposal to set standard against dual metrics with equal weighting. We've suggested we wouldn't support that approach because we don't think that giving landlords that choice would necessarily meet fuel poverty, health and thermal comfort needs that we have. And then they've also asked for alternatives. Here we've sort of suggested that there might be the potential in the future to set a better overarching standard. So thinking about more in-use performance, more real-world data, a comprehensive retrofit assessment, a medium-term plan, and moving towards a more sort of outcomes-based approach to transitioning buildings. we don't think the government are ready to do this yet, but we think there's some real interesting potential in a more outcomes-based approach to regulation that we'll potentially be exploring over the next few months. I'm going to hand over to Cara.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to talk about the cost cap. So the recommendation or the government sort of proposal here is to increase the cost cap that landlords have to pay to invest and upgrade their properties from £3,500 to £15,000. And then also introducing an affordability exemption. We don't know exactly what that is yet. So that would lower the cost cap to £10,000 investment for some landlords. So that could be means testing, it could be rental income, it could be something else. Can we go to the next slide? So this question really is about the government's proposal to increase the maximum investment to £15,000. And yeah, we support that. We think it reflects updated prices and will make sure that more homes actually meet those standards. We also think that, in our EPC reform consultation, we mentioned that actually there could be improvements to the recommendations within EPCs, and they will be needed to make sure that that £15,000 is spent the best way that it can be, and is spent on linked measures rather than a random selection of bits and bobs. The cost cap should be linked with inflation, and that will encourage landlords to act more quickly to get as many homes upgraded as possible, as soon as possible. And actually, the research that we've done that we linked to earlier did suggest that landlords view regulations as a ceiling rather than a floor, so really seeking to meet the minimum. So trying to do the most that we can to encourage the most upgrades as possible. So through EPC reform and through cost cap increases, will encourage a higher standard naturally. And can we go to the next slide? So yeah, this is about the cost cap exemption period. So at the moment, if you've spent the £3,500, you don't have to spend £3,500 again. You don't need to do any more upgrades for 5 years. But the government is expecting or anticipating increasing this to 10. We agree with the proposal to move it up to 10. We think that actually.
Oh, sorry, Cara. I
think with sorry, this one... I'm going. Yeah, no, I'm backwards. We wanted to keep it at 5. We don't want 10. Sorry. So 10 years will keep tenants in fuel poverty for longer. 10-year exemption will mean that you can make upgrades, or you can be exempt for any other reason and not need to make further upgrades for another 10 years, which will really slow down our transition to net zero, slow down reduction in fuel poverty targets and things like that. So we think we should keep the 5-year exemption, but what we do need to make sure of is that there is adequate finance for landlords to make sure that they can actually meet that spending and are able to afford that. That's something that we've kind of mentioned throughout our response, is that finance, the right kind of financial products for landlords' individual circumstances do need to be in place. There are lots of different circumstances that landlords have that may or may not limit their ability to borrow and things like that. So we need to make sure that products are designed accordingly. And then we'll go to the next slide. So yeah, this is about the affordability exemption I mentioned earlier. So should the government develop an affordability exemption? We do not think there should be an affordability exemption. This is because there is a likelihood that the landlords that would be eligible for this affordability exemption will be renting to the most vulnerable tenants, and basically putting those most vulnerable people who need those reductions in fuel poverty and those reductions in energy costs the most. So again, just really we're trying to stress that there needs to be a suitable range of financial products available. So if people are going to struggle to meet that for whatever reason, that there is a financial product that they can use that is accessible to them that will make that cost affordable. So we do see that there is a potential risk of landlords passing costs directly onto tenants through increasing rent. So our research with landlords does indicate that that is an option that many landlords will take. And we really think that it's important that there's mitigation to that risk to protect tenants. So this won't necessarily be part of this consultation, but as we see the Renters' Rights Bill and other reforms coming forward, we really think it's important and necessary to safeguard tenants, to make sure that we limit rent increases and prevent also post-upgrade evictions. So to make sure that homes aren't upgraded either through grants or through landlord funding, and then evicted in order for the landlord to bring in people at a higher rent. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Cara. The next piece that they're consulting on is timelines. So they're proposing that these rules will apply for new tenancies in 2028 and for existing tenancies by 2030. The consultation that was released back in 2020 by the previous government had shorter timelines than that. I think new tenancies was 2025, which is right now, and existing tenancies was 2028. So understandable that unfortunately those sooner targets aren't now possible. But what we would say here is, you know, minimum energy efficiency standard increases have been in the pipeline since the 2020 consultation. Landlords have known that something is coming here, and hopefully many of them have been planning towards that change. As a network that has many participants within the retrofit supply chain, what we see here is that actually what the sector needs most of all is clarity and confidence that the timelines are concrete. The supply chain is really crucial for getting this work delivered. So those designing, coordinating, installing, producing, and overseeing measures need to be supported to develop and grow their businesses and come into the sector, and clear timelines will really help that. That is why 2020 and 2030 are really probably quite good timelines, because they're set, the 2021 is set within the existing government's parliament. So the idea here is that we know that it won't get scrapped or pushed by a potential new government that comes in. And we think that the sector confidence in this is really, really keen. We need to be giving really clear messaging that these timelines will not be withdrawn, they will not be revised, because the potential here is for these regulations to really help boost and grow the whole retrofit sector, which would benefit many other tenures as well. And you know, there's an urgency as well. Tenants have been left in poorly performing homes for much too long, and they urgently need these upgrades. They're also consulting on how we transition from the old standard to the new standard. So the first piece is there's going to be a period of time when new EPCs are introduced, but new MEES hasn't kicked in. So new EPCs are likely to be introduced in 2026. New MEES is likely to be introduced in 2028. So there's a 2-year period where you'll have a new EPC, but you won't have to meet a higher standard. What they're essentially saying is, let's keep things the same from a minimum energy efficiency standard perspective for those 2 years. So a landlord who currently has an EPCE, who gets a new EPC in 2026 with the new metrics, won't be forced to meet a equivalent of EPCE in the new metrics. They're allowed to be demonstrating their compliance until the new MEES kicks in. We agree with this because we think that trying to introduce a transitional EPCE would be quite complicated. It won't do much to provide very much benefit for tenants because any changes would likely be very incremental. You could adversely affect some landlords rather than others, just depending on when they happen to have their EPC renewed. So we think that landlord time, resource and funding would be better spent planning towards upgrades to the new standard rather than trying to fill in this little gap here. So we agree with the government. The next bit, which is also quite confusing, is that there are homes and properties that currently have an EPCC, and the government are consulting on whether or not those should be recognised as compliant with the future standard until their EPC expires or is replaced. So the purpose of this is really to make sure that landlords who are doing that upgrade work now, who are getting in there, making sure that they're providing better quality homes for tenants, aren't then penalised later in the future by a new standard requiring slightly different measures to the ones that they've already committed to. Their EPCs are currently valid for 10 years. So you can imagine if you got an EPC C in 2026, that would be valid until 2036, which would delay when you'd have to meet new metrics. There are risks and benefits associated with this proposal. So risks in red, EPCC is a less robust standard than what the government are proposing. So some homes will be kept at a lower performance for longer. But the benefit is that landlords can get started right now. They don't have to wait for new EPCs to come in. They don't have to wait for new standards to come in. we won't create a bottleneck in the supply chain at 2028 because they can get started. Another risk, though, is that the energy efficiency rating, the current EPC metric, doesn't incentivize the switch to low carbon heat. In fact, switching to a heat pump can often make your EPC slightly worse, but it would encourage you to improve your fabric. And there's going to be some confusion around compliance because essentially local authorities are going to see two different systems essentially running alongside one another. We've got some potential solutions here, which would be to allow the current EPC of B to act as a temporary proxy with compliance. It's a higher standard. It's more in line with what we think is appropriate for the fabric rating. And then still require landlords to meet a secondary metric on heat decarbonisation and smart readiness. So essentially say, look, right now you can do some work, you can get yourself compliance with that first piece of the puzzle, the fabric rating. When the new EPC comes in, you'll have to then comply with either the secondary with either one of the secondary metrics on heat decarbonisation by 2028. So that you can kind of phase the works that they might need. All of this has got to be really clearly communicated to tenants because many of them won't understand why a letter in one system is different from another and what is compliant and when the timescales might be for both tenants and landlords. So clear communication is going to be key because this piece is complicated and confusing. And back to you, Cara.
Complicated and confusing, I think, are the words of this consultation. So this is about commissioning EPCs. So at the moment, you need a pre-improvement EPCs. You need an EPC to rent a property to make sure that you're compliant with E. You don't necessarily need to do a post-improvement EPC. The proposals are, well, there are questions on pre-improvement and post-improvement EPCs and then whether they should be included in the cost cap. If we go to the next slide. Thank you. So yeah, the government has proposed to require landlords to commission a new PC before taking action to comply with the higher standards. So we think that if landlords are intending to apply for any kind of cost cap based exemption or like an all improvements made kind of exemption, you will need to have an EPC to prove that. So to make sure that they've actually taken the correct measures recommended before they've reached the cost cap. But what the slight issue with that is that sometimes the recommendations inside an EPC are not necessarily comprehensive at the moment, or they can miss or include actually inappropriate measures. So in our EPC consultation response, we have actually talked quite a lot about this and how recommendations within EPCs just really need to be improved. EPCs at the moment are kind of, the only sort of form of statutory advice out there on this kind of work. So they really need to be making the right recommendations. If we are essentially saying that landlords must commission one before doing work, we need to then say that what they're being recommended to do in the EPC is the correct thing for that property. We also don't want to discourage people from taking more professional advice or different advice from other places than the EPC. So we think there should be an option for landlords to seek that expert advice. So we don't want to put off people from going to retrofit coordinators, designers, surveyors, architects, and we think they should be able to do that to get that advice to meet the new standards. So we think that if someone has done that, they shouldn't really need to get a pre-improvement EPC as well. And can we go to the next one? Thank you. So then, this is about whether the cost of this new EPC should be included within the cost cap. I think this is an interesting question. I mean, EPCs are quite cheap at the moment. We think they should just be paid for by landlords and not part of the cost cap. It's not a significant cost. It shouldn't make that much difference either way. But we have suggested that if there were advanced or higher level EPCs that would be introduced that would be at a higher cost, then that could be included in the cost cap. So not discouraging people from seeking expert advice, but saying that if you do get a higher level of advice, you can include that in your cost cap, but this basic EPC, you've got to just pay for it yourself. Next slide, please. So this is about requiring landlords to commission a post-improvement EPC. So after they have sought to meet the new standard, and then also whether the cost of that should be included in the cost cap. I mean, we think that a post-improvement EPC should always be required as a way to demonstrate compliance, and also to give local and national governments the information they need to track some of these policy targets. So around net zero fuel poverty and health, it just, yeah, it makes it a lot easier if all the information is actually accurate and up to date and reflects the state of the property as it is. So in the EPC reform consultation response, we did actually make suggestions about dynamic input for EPCs, which would like kind of reduce some of this burden of basically double testing the same property potentially within quite a short space of time. So with the introduction of a dynamic input EPC, you could, if you had the correct evidence, just get an update to an EPC rather than having to have someone come out and check again. So yeah, that's something that we've talked about in our EPC consultation response.
Thanks, Cara. And yeah, a barrier that comes up that's mentioned often by landlords is gaining access to get those EPCs. So if you could introduce a dynamic one and you only had to have access once, that could help mitigate that issue. So the consultation also includes questions on increasing the scope of EPCs to apply them to short-term lets and the exemptions that are on EPCs. So there are a number of exemptions that are discussed. The first are the all relevant improvements made and high cost exemptions. They're directly related to the cost cap. So we don't go into these in much more detail, but essentially they mean if you have spent up to the cost cap, and the next measure that your EPC recommends would push you over it, you can apply for an all relevant improvements made exemption. And if the only improvement you can make costs more than the cost cap, you apply for a high cost exemption. So there we're really referring back to the comments we've previously made. There are some other exemptions. One is called wall insulation. That's if the only relevant improvements that are shown on the EPC are cavity wall insulation, external wall insulation, or internal wall insulation, and those measures would negatively impact the fabric and structure of the property, you can claim an exemption. So we've got thoughts on that, which I'll discuss in a moment. There's third party consent. So if you can't get consent from people that you need to, that might be planning departments, it might be freeholders. If it's a leasehold property, it might be the tenants themselves. Then you can apply for an exemption if you've used your best efforts to get that consent. There's one on property devaluation, which means that if a surveyor says that making energy efficiency improvements would devalue your property by more than 5%, you can claim an exemption. And there's also a temporary exemption due to recently becoming a landlord, which the government are proposing to simplify, which essentially means if you buy a house that happens to have a tenant in and it happens to be non-compliant, you've got a little bit of time to act, which does seem reasonable. So first off, should MEES apply to short-term lets? At the moment, it doesn't. So if you're thinking, Airbnbs, holiday cottages, places where the person letting, the landlord, pays the bills, currently they're not covered by MEES. And the idea behind that was that the tenant wasn't paying, so it was in the landlord's interest anyway to make the upgrades, and that protection wasn't needed. Now, the government are proposing to increase the scope so that short-term lets are included. And I think one of the big reasons behind that is because what they don't want to see is landlords with a non-compliant home deciding to switch into the short-term rental market because it gets them out of having to make the upgrades and having to spend the time investing. We know that there have been issues, particularly in sort of coastal locations, with short-term rentals hollowing out the private rental sector market, and also leaving behind some negative consequences. So in order to basically protect the supply of affordable housing in the private rental sector, we need to make sure that short-term lets are brought into MEES so that there's not an incentive to essentially switch to a short-term let. We also think that this would, have a better impact globally because it means that we're picking up much more information and upgrading all of our homes and contributes to wider decarbonisation goals. They just need to make sure that this wouldn't, they're clear on it. It's not going to apply to temporary structures. It's not going to apply to things like caravans or shepherd's huts where building regulations don't already apply. It would just be sort of homes that are already classed within building regulations. And then we go into the exemptions. So wall insulation exemption. We think that there may be a limited number of occasions where this exemption is applicable, probably less than are currently claiming this exemption. Because we think that in most cases there will be a suitable wall insulation solution. So we think there needs to be really strong requirements on the written expert evidence that is required to get this exemption, that bio-based, hygroscopic, breathable insulation solutions have been considered, and that a full dynamic condensation risk assessment has been provided to demonstrate why they're not suitable. The government's already got lots of really clear advice on things like internal wall insulation and managing condensation risk. So they should be really clear on what needs to come out of that expert advice, because what we don't want to see is a one pager from someone saying this is inappropriate, but with no evidence backing that, because it's essentially maybe quite an easy route to sort of not make those improvements. The next one is third party consent. So generally, these are due to barriers upgrading leasehold homes, upgrading homes in conservation areas, or where there are additional planning requirements. And we know that leasehold properties, for example, make up 10% of the PRS. So we think the government here should be really targeting the removal of this exemption, but they need to take action in order to do that. So, for example, setting a clear legal process for how leasehold homes should be upgraded, including mechanisms for collective improvements and how to engage with freeholders. Potentially applying MEES to freehold landlords. Would be interested to see your thoughts on that in the chat, and whether or not where works the building fabric owned and controlled by the freeholder is impacting the energy performance of individual leasehold apartments, should they have some responsibility under MEES to make upgrades. We also think that there might be work the government could do in extending permitted development rights, allowing fabric changes and low carbon heating and renewable energy, and really clear guidance on how relevant measures can be taken within conservation areas, building on some of the work that Historic England released last year on retrofit and historic buildings. Property devaluation. We think that this exemption should be removed. We think it's really open to abuse and fraud. Property is only worth what someone is prepared to pay for it. A surveyor's valuation is just an estimate of that. These standards are really meant to be there to protect tenants, and this exemption would probably prioritise landlord wealth over tenant comfort. The only sort of reason why we can see that property might be devalued by having these works done is if the measures would cause material damage to the property. And we think if that's the case, then it should be dealt with through a similar exemption to the wall exemption, requiring expert advice from like a building physicist rather than a surveyor. So either this one should be removed or it should be changed so that it's more about the sort of fabric and condition of the building than the sort of perceptions on what someone may or may not want to pay. And back to you, Cara.
Thank you. So now there's a little bit of a section on smart meters, and I think I'm also going to talk straight on into something about letting agents as well. So if we can go to the next one. Thank you. So yeah, this is about asking what actions government could take, including changes to the law to encourage or require smart meters in properties and to increase the number of smart meters installed in the PRS. So yeah, I mean, the smart meter rollout has not been the most gigantic of successes. So there are quite a few properties that do not have smart meters, and that is also true for the private rented sector. So yeah, we do support the government's ambition to increase the uptake of smart meters in the private rented sector. They're actually, I mean, they're a really important tool for tenants to reduce bills by gaining access to smart tariffs and things like that, which usually are associated with cheaper running costs. But I think, I mean, and this is beyond the PRS, this is, across the board for all 10 years, there are issues with consumer confidence and trust in smart meters. So the government really does need to make a concerted effort to tackle that. People are almost certainly going to need smart meters. So encouraging the uptake through the PRS through all 10 years is going to be really important, but people are going to need to be brought along on that journey. So yeah, I think there is a bit of work for the government to do there in just a bit of education, a bit of confidence. I think especially around access to data, there have been concerns there. So then also our research that we did with landlords kind of really suggests very minimal interaction between landlord and tenant. So what we don't want to be the case is that a tenant is sitting in a property thinking, oh, I wish I could have a smart meter, but I can't because I don't know how to contact my landlord. I don't know who my landlord is. We have actually proposed that tenants are empowered to contact energy suppliers directly to get the smart meter installed. The tenant is the one that has the, well, in most cases, not in all cases, but where the tenant pays the bills, they're the ones that have the relationship with the person, the body that would be installing it anyway. So it just makes sense that actually a tenant can just do that without permission from the landlord. On to the next slide, thank you. So yeah, this is, I mean, it's a very similar vein. So what actions could the government take, including changes of the law to encourage or require smart meters in properties undergoing upgrades and to increase the number of smart meters installed? So yeah, we've kind of really suggested that regulation that requires real world data to show compliance would encourage smart meter uptake. And beyond that, it would have the benefit of ensuring that improvements actually deliver the outcomes that are needed. So at the moment, there is the case that you could be putting in measures that either aren't doing what you intended them to do or are working poorly. And actually, with some real world performance data through smart meters, you could verify some of that and have a bit more confidence that the outcomes that you want from the measures that you've installed are actually taking place or actually happening. So yeah, we've kind of then said if the fabric metric is selected as one that the government would want landlords to aim for, then in-use performance data from smart meters or other basic monitoring could support compliance. Can we go to the next slide? Oh yeah, so then we're moving on to lettings agents. So this is about really, the government has suggested putting some more requirements on lettings agents, but in this current consultation, they would like to not make any changes yet and wait for the development of the PRS database, which is going to be happening likely through the Renters' Rights Bill. So keeping any requirements specifically on lettings agents to kind of have any role in MEES on pause until we have the Renters' Rights Bill through and we have the development of a private rented sector database. We really actually think the lettings agents already have all the information they need to make sure that properties that they rent are compliant. It's, I mean, lettings agents know the EPC of the property. They need that before they can rent the property anyway. So we don't think that there is really any need to wait for that database to be in place to put the requirements on lettings agents now. MEES enforcement is a big deal. It's a lot of work for local authorities, and actually the more that we can do now and the more that lettings agents can do to ensure that properties that come to market are compliant is going to help ease that burden.
Great, thanks, Cara. The government are also opening up questions on the previous reform consultation, which was done in 2020. And there are a few areas where we've got additional comments based on our research with landlords and our stakeholder interviews and also our work trying to form consensus on EPC reform. So I'm going to go through some of these, but there are more elements that you may well wish to comment on. So do have a look at the sort of the second section of the consultation. So the first bit is on future tightening of the regulations in the 2030s. So this is the idea that this might just be the beginning, and could we go further, and how might we do that? So what we're saying here is that these MEES right now must meet fuel poverty, health and comfort needs of tenants as best as possible, given the current system that we exist within and the current tools we already have. We think that that does mean ensuring that real world performance is achieved, and that fabric condition is being properly considered and performance monitoring is used to support compliance. However, we think on top of that, there's space for improvements. We definitely think that there's more we can do towards move towards much more healthy homes and much more resilient homes. In our response to the EPC reform consultation and in a paper that we brought out on EPC reform, we called for the development of two new metrics, well, a few new metrics, but two important ones. One was a health metric and the other was a climate resilience metric. The health metric would focus on indoor air quality, potentially outdoor air quality, thermal comfort, the holistic approach to health in the building. And the climate resilience metric would particularly think about risk of overheating and risk of flood, potentially also risk of drought, which could be quite easily calculated for many homes. We think they would drive really positive outcomes for tenants. And we also support a shift towards a more outcomes-based, evidence-informed regulation. So really keeping the door open to say, this is where we need to get to right now, but this isn't as far as we could possibly go. This isn't delivering best practice net zero homes. We think that there's space to go further, and make sure that we're doing more to really truly deliver the outcomes that we need for everyone. Increasing awareness of the PRS regulations. So we had a stakeholder meeting with some local authorities, and one of them raised a really interesting risk, which was they talked about the recent backlash against net zero strategies that's been sort of led by those in the media who benefit from the status quo. What we really don't want to see is these new regulations being linked to and strengthening a backlash against net zero. That means that the government needs to deliver really positive messaging around the regulations, make the benefits clear to landlords, tenants, and wider society, ensure that there are protections on excessive rent increases for tenants. What we really, really cannot see is a link between net zero planning and higher rents, because that as a message will have a really negative consequence, not only on these regulations, but wider plans to move towards net zero. So that protection needs to be made, because we don't want to see news headlines saying, I was evicted because of these standards. No one benefits from that. There's also a question on the MEES compliance and enforcement database. This was something that was proposed during the last consultation. Some of this will get baked into the new PRS database. But we think that there's more that can be done here. Local authority capacity to enforce MEES is quite low in most areas. And we think that private rented sector database that will be introduced as part of the Renters' Rights Bill will be a benefit, but we think that the scope and ambition can be included so that it's a registration and licensing database that can be then used by local authorities to really support their compliance and enforcement. Most landlords reacted quite positively when we talked to them about the idea of registration, and local authorities can get impact and income from those schemes, which helps them enable enforcement activity. So we think that that database itself could be quite a powerful tool if it's explored and expanded to provide what local authorities need. And then finally, there's a question on additional information and evidence that we want to provide. So we're going to signpost to two documents. The first is our report on the future of energy performance certificates, a roadmap for change. We published this last year following I think 3 or 4 workshops with hundreds of people, many of you may have been included, an industry survey and more, setting out our roadmap for what EPCs could look like and the impact they could have. And we'll post a link to that in the chat. And also, I don't know, Cara, if you want to say a few words on the raising standards in the private rental sector report.
Yeah. So this is a report that came out earlier this year. So yeah, in February, it was in partnership with Impact on Urban Health, and really looked at quite holistically how to raise standards in the private rental sector. So there are recommendations there and work there on minimum energy efficiency standards as one way to raise standards, but it looks a little bit wider than that as well. So there are other sort of things that we've looked at around compliance enforcement and so on. To do that work, we had workshops with stakeholders. Again, some of you might have been in those workshops, and we also spoke directly with landlords to really get their views on some of the policy proposals that already exist and some new ones as well. So to try and really see what the impact of any changes would be, and whether we would have this the big exodus that has been threatened on landlords of any change in regulation. So I think the kind of summary from that was that landlords are actually very pragmatic and we're mostly just looking for clear directions on how to meet standards, to not exceed them, but how to meet them. So I think that's where a lot of our ideas around the ambition for these standards has come from, and to make them to make them as ambitious but realistic as possible, to make sure the support for landlords is there, to make sure that they know how to meet this. But ultimately, this is also about the health and well-being of tenants as well. So how we can improve the health and well-being of tenants while supporting landlords to do that.
Excellent. So yeah, just to give you a bit of a recap, the consultation closes on the 2nd of May. We think it would be great if as many of you as possible could respond to that. We'll be sending out an email within our newsletter either tomorrow or on Thursday morning with this webinar recording with our consultation response within it. Please use as much or as little of that as you like to help inform your own responses. This is part of a wider piece of research that we've been doing with the support of impact on urban health that started with the report that Cara mentioned. After the consultation closes, we'll be looking at what the future of this type of regulation looks like. We've particularly started focusing on outcomes-based regulation, whether that would be a positive step for the industry and what is missing as part of that in order to deliver sort of meaningful outcomes to tenants. We'll also be doing some more research into what protections are needed for tenants to make sure that these insights and regulations are as impactful as possible, but protect tenants as much as they can. So thanks very much. I'm going to have a great time going through the chat and picking up all your comments later. Thanks so much for joining us. And if you have any follow-up comments, you can always send them to the info at email address, and we'll try and pick them up as long as you send them today. Thanks so much, everyone, and thanks, Cara.
Thanks both.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've just been listening in, but very interesting. Thank you very much.